Welcome to PACKOLUTION. In this podcast series, you'll hear the experts of the packaging industry talking about sustainability and the future of packaging. It is brought to you by Watron and hosted by one of its founders, Michaela Wachtel, and Sales Director Ton Kniepscher.
Welcome to another episode of PACKOLUTION, the disruptive podcast brought to you by Watron. Today we have Marcel Keuenhof of the KIDV, Netherlands Institute for Sustainable Packaging, as our guest. Welcome, Marcel.
Thank you, Tom.
Please tell us a bit about your career path and the association you are now working for.
Right. So indeed, as you said in the intro, I'm working for the Netherlands Institute for Sustainable Packaging, which is a reasonably small not-for-profit organization in the Netherlands linked to the EPR organization we have here, the Dutch Packaging Waste Fund. We were set up about 8 years ago to help companies transition to more sustainable packaging. We do this by giving advice, creating knowledge, gathering knowledge from universities and other knowledge institutes, one-on-one sessions explaining how the system works, how recycling goes, what is a logical solution or not, how the waste system is set up, and so forth. I've been working with KIDV for about 3 years now. I'm one of their 6 packaging technologists, and all of us have a little bit different focus. I, for example, am linked to recycling of glass and metal packaging. I run a small platform, community of practice, as we call it, on the topic of reusable packaging particularly, which is an upcoming trend. And you were asking how did I come here in my career, because I've been working in packaging for about 20 years now, packaging technologist by education. I've worked for a number of packaging manufacturers in glass, carton board, and the last half my career I was working for food manufacturers, Kraft Heinz, for example, and Bessanen, who is producing organic food.
And as a small Dutch association, how is it working out for you to operate on an international scale? Do you work, for example, with other European organizations to be stronger?
Yeah, that's a very valid question. I mean, we are, of course, as the Netherlands Institute for Sustainable Packaging within Europe or even internationally, a very small player, obviously. Our focus mainly is companies that put packaging materials onto the Dutch market, whether they're Dutch players or international ones. But obviously, by working with other organizations outside the Netherlands, we are able to have more impact or actually, give better answers, you could say, because if a large, fast-moving consumer good company puts their packaging on the Dutch market, quite likely they do it in other countries as well. So for them, they would rather have a one-stop shop to be able to answer all these sustainability questions for packaging in Europe. Unfortunately, this does not exist. So we as KIDV, we do strive to collaborate with other organizations, and we actually have set up a platform for that. We call it Pack Forward, where we collaborate with other EPR organizations in other European countries, because it is still quite scattered, the knowledge around sustainability. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge, but not a lot of knowledge is centralized or aligned, I would almost say. Definitions, every country or sometimes even every organization has his or her own definition of sustainability or recyclability. So in our opinion, collaboration is key, which is kind of logical, I guess, for a small country as the Netherlands. But also, this has been our experience in the last 8 years of building our institute. So yeah, we most definitely collaborate with other players.
That's a good point. You mentioned earlier that the sustainability, it's very apparent that there are many different approaches and demands in this area. Could you elaborate a bit on these definitions of sustainability?
Yeah, that's how long do you have, Ton? Because sustainability is obviously something I talk about a lot, and I like talking about sustainability. But in this case, we focus obviously on packaging, and even then, there are many angles to how one could define sustainable packaging. Yeah. I mean, quite often you see the definition of recyclability. A lot of brand owners, they defined 100% recyclable packaging as their goal in 2025, for example. Yes. But there is also quite a movement of you could almost call it anti-plastic sentiments, whether amongst consumers, which then translates through to marketing into companies' targets. So a reduction of plastic packaging, replacement of plastic with other materials, which opens a whole lot of other issues and benefits and disadvantages. But another definition of sustainability could be lowest CO2 output, for example, or it could be prevent the use of fossil fuels, so move to bio-based materials. It could be reusability. So there's many definitions that you have for sustainable packaging.
What about life cycle analysis, for example?
Well, that's a very valid point. One of the strategies that I mentioned, or one of the angles to look at sustainability, could be the lowest carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. And, in order to do that, you need to have some sort of an assessment, of course, what your packaging, what impact it has. And to do that, life cycle assessment is a very useful tool. And actually the industry standard, I would almost say. We do emphasize, though, that the impact of a packed product is obviously not only the packaging. Our philosophy is you always need to look at the combination of the packaging and the product that it contains. Quite often, in 99% of the cases, I would say, the product that is inside the packaging has a far larger carbon footprint or environmental impact than the packaging itself. It's not always the case. There are obviously examples of a lot of packaging material for a very small product, but most of the time the product has a far greater environmental impact, which makes it also sensible to balance the focus on the packaging versus the focus on the product and the combination thereof.
Correct. And when it comes to food packaging, for example, if the food goes to waste, that's not only cost inefficient, but it's also unethical.
Yeah, interesting that you bring up ethics. We have a moral obligation almost to prevent any food that we create on this planet to go to waste. In fact, it's close to 1/3 of all food manufactured is actually not being consumed, nor by humans, nor by animals. And that in itself, if you talk about impact and sustainability, is a massive, massive impact. It's one of the things that we must look into where packaging actually plays a role. I personally, a number of years ago, was very intrigued by this aspect, food waste, and the link and the impact that I could have as a packaging technologist was to explore how can and does packaging help this topic. That we're talking then about solutions like extending the shelf life of a product, or making sure that packaging prevents products from spoiling. In certain countries where the climate is not ideal, or there's a lot of vermin or insects, packaging obviously plays a big role in preventing it from being lost. And still, with all these technologies, 1/3 goes to waste. So we do obviously, as a knowledge institute for sustainable packaging, our focus is the packaging materials itself. But the focus, we believe, should definitely be the packaging and products combined.
You already mentioned what requirements you see for sustainable food packaging. Are there any more requirements that you think are essential for food packaging?
A very valid question. Indeed, beyond looking at the combination of the product and the packaging in terms of finding the lowest environmental impact, there's a number of other elements that we feel you should or can look at to reduce the impact of packaging. That would, entail things like do not overpack. Do not underpack as well. Obviously, underpacking meaning you use too little packaging material, which causes breakage or food waste or spoilage, yep. But also do not overpack. And I guess in these times of e-commerce and people ordering online, we all know these examples of a huge box with a small product inside. The systems in place sometimes make that this is the way it works for e-commerce, but at the same time we all feel that transporting air and too much packaging material doesn't make sense. So no overpacking would be almost a no-brainer, I would say. At the same time, if you do use packaging materials, please make sure that they can be recycled. So, try to prevent mixing different materials. So go for mono materials when possible. If you mix different materials, make sure they can be disattached by the consumer. Inform the consumer about where to discard packaging. So there's a number of strategies that come into play for an optimal or most sustainable food packaging.
You're already mentioning the consumer here. You are really addressing the consumer. And many say that they want to consume sustainably, but what they actually do is a totally different story. Maybe you can say something about that.
Very valid point. This is something that consumer psychologists often call the say-do gap. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. I'm not a consumer psychologist in any way, but we do obviously recognize that the influence of the consumer on the sustainability of your packaging is quite crucial. particularly, not only when you purchase a product, you have the choice to buy one product with less or more recyclable material, etc., but particularly also when discarding the empty packaging. Differs a bit per country, obviously, but quite a few countries try separating waste at the source. So when consumers, they put paper and carton in a separate box or bag, plastics and metal packaging in one, and so forth. The situation is a little bit different per country, so it might be confusing for the consumer. Where do I put this packaging? It's plastic and paper combined. Can I put it with the paper packaging, yes or no? Or should it go with the plastics waste stream? So their communication to the consumer is crucial. At the same time, we also know that most consumers don't check on the packaging where they need to put it. Most of the time because, they have used that packaging before and they kind of already know where to put it, or, think this is the best way to discard of it. But a lot of times, there is different messages for the consumer and they don't necessarily know. I mean, I'm a packaging technologist, so here at home, I'm obviously strictly watching my kids, how they separate their waste. But even for them and myself, sometimes it's not clear. How does it make sense? Because, I'm diving a little bit into the recycling element of packaging, but recycling is not exact science. It is, also chance. If you put the plastic packaging in the plastic packaging bag or box, most of the times it will be properly selected, but sometimes if it, falls off the transport belt or it is not necessarily correctly recognized or it was squashed in the transport. So there's still quite a lot of technological advancements that we can do, but it also, it doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make the message consistent. There is also the fact that in some municipalities you have pre-sorting, so the consumer at home separates the waste. In other municipalities, it is post-consumer sorting. So the consumer puts everything together, perhaps paper and carton separately and their garden waste, etc. But for the rest, most packaging waste goes together. The Netherlands is a very scattered situation. It differs per municipality. And that makes the message also a bit confusing. And that's only in the Netherlands. So if you then look at Europe, referring to the earlier question on collaborating with other institutes doing the same, this is on one hand crucial and necessary to have a consistent message. At the same time, each country has also a certain tradition in how they collect waste, what consumers are used to doing, and so forth. And that makes it tricky sometimes.
So consuming sustainably actually also means recycling sustainably. Certainly.
I mean, repeating what I said before, if you don't need a certain material or, for that matter, a product, please don't buy it, I would almost say. And so in behavior, there's a lot more besides looking at the packaging only that you can do to reduce impact. And, I will not go into a tangent on should we or should we not fly 2-3 times per year? Should we eat meat? Yes, no. That's obviously a different discussion. But the same type of decisions could play a role for packaging. And this is also, for example, why you see a trend into zero waste lifestyles, reusable packaging on the rise. So this is a very interesting development, I personally think, because sometimes, having choice for a consumer makes it also difficult to, in the case of packaging, try to recycle it properly. Because in the end, recycling sounds like a cure to solve all the problems, but actually it's not so efficient. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of transportation, which causes diesel, a lot of pollution. So any packaging that does not need to be recycled might be better to do.
I liked your statement about the say-do gap. That's really intriguing. And I recognized it with myself as well, to be honest. So that's very, very open. But let's circle back to food here for a minute. In your point of view, what are the requirements for sustainable food packaging?
Requirement for sustainable food packaging, again, depending obviously on the definition of sustainability. For food packaging, we mentioned before, food waste is an important element. So if you can prolong the shelf life of your food product with a number of days, weeks, or months, sometimes even, it can have a positive effect on the overall impact of the packaging and the product in combination, because less food will be thrown away. This might mean at the same time that you need more packaging material. And this is a bit counterintuitive, you could say, if you talk about sustainability of packaging, because reduce seems to be a logical tactic. But looking at the packaging and the product in combination, not necessarily so. Take the example of meat. I don't know. century ago, half a century ago, probably even before plastic packaging was around, meat rarely was packed. It was also quite often directly consumed or preserved through smoking or salting, whatever. But in our current society, and there's another link to consumers and the way our systems are created, we like the convenience. We like the convenience of packed food. Because, this is basically what supermarkets do, right? They take away the hassle and the work of, slaughtering your own lamb, raising your own chickens, baking your own bread at 6 a.m, and so forth. So the convenience and the extra time that packaging has brought, it's difficult to say goodbye to that. So the say-do gap that you mentioned also comes into play here. Yes, it is possible if I cycle to the bakery on the other side of the city and buy a bread unpacked, and then at home, use some waxed cloth, for example, to pack it in and keep it fresh for long enough so that I don't have any dried out bread. At the same time, convenience, if I look at myself personally in this case, do I have the time to cycle to the other side of the city every 2 days? Not really. So, it's a lifestyle thing at the same time. So with the lifestyle that we have, with the processes, industrial processes of food packaging in large quantities that we have in place, the packaging that we currently have quite often, in all honesty, is quite sustainable and has quite a low impact. And for sure, we can think of quite a few examples where less packaging material would not create any extra waste or food waste or product breakage. So those you could call the low-hanging fruit, particularly where marketing elements play a role. So if you would create, I have no idea, a shampoo bottle, and the most sustainable shampoo bottle in terms of grams of plastic would be a quite boring, round, short bottle. But for a lot of products, the marketing is, of course, crucial in terms of, hitting your sales. So they would elaborate, create new designs, new colors, new shapes, which not necessarily makes them more sustainable. But at the same time, this is how society works. We have competing companies, and that creates that packaging is not always the most sustainable. So on one hand, there's a lot of things we can do. But if you would imagine that, then you would have a supermarket which would have 2 or 3 shapes for shampoos because those are considered the most sustainable. But that would create all kinds of other problems if you look at the way we've set our system up now.
We already go into the material of the packaging, from what I hear. And there is an ongoing discussion about what type of packaging is the most sustainable. You already said a little bit about it. It's glass versus plastic versus paper. What are the advantages and hurdles and problems of each of these packagings? Maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, this is a question we get a lot, obviously, as a Knowledge Institute for Sustainable Packaging. Which material is the most sustainable, or which packaging type is the most sustainable? And our answer is basically that you can't really say that overall or in general. It very much depends on the product you're packing, the system where the product is sold, the requirements for that product. I mean, linking again to the product packaging combination I told before, the environmental footprint, where do you get your materials from? So it's, on one hand, to answer this question is almost impossible because there's many definitions of sustainability. And on the other hand, material that works for one packaging type and has the lowest environmental impact for that product type, let's say a bread packaging, can be a very transparent monomaterial plastic bag that is properly recyclable in one country. In another country where plastics of that size and dimension, for example, are not separated in recycling streams and therefore end up in incineration, perhaps. So giving an answer is quite tricky and almost impossible, and very much depending on the product you pack, the application, the market you sell it in, the recycling systems in place. And, with CO2 impact being a factor that often is referred to, you see, of course, that certain materials, specifically the heavier ones, let's say glass, for example, or metal packaging, and also materials that take a lot of energy to create, they tend to have higher CO2 outputs because of the fact that they are heavy. So then transportation, it takes extra diesel and so forth. On the other hand, if your sustainability definition is recyclability, then these materials are actually quite good. Glass is almost infinitely recyclable. Metal comes very close. So depending on the angle you choose, every material has a different benefit and a different disadvantage. I mean, plastics, we talked about this, and the sentiment that seems to be surrounding plastic packaging not necessarily being a good one, which, in all fairness, is understandable if you look at elements like littering, plastics in the ocean, microplastics in our body, and so forth. On the other hand, it also feels underappreciated for the good work or the benefits that plastic brings, because it's extremely light, obviously. So if you look at CO2 output in transportation thereof, for example, it's very efficient. It gives very good barrier usually. And recyclability is a little bit tricky. This is also at the same time a material that we've been creating a recycling industry at a higher speed only the last, 10, 20 years perhaps. And the last few years with more emphasis on recyclability it's speeding up. But so depending on the angle that you take, each material has benefits and disadvantages of its own. Same goes for paper packaging. The anti-plastic trend that I mentioned, paper packaging is often looked at. And if you, again, ask a consumer which packaging they find the most sustainable, the answer differs a little bit per country, but quite often it is opposite of what experts would find a material or a packaging solution in terms of sustainability. Paper, often considered very natural because it comes from trees. At the same time, recycling paper requires a lot of energy as well. And these fibers, they don't live forever. Cellulose fiber can be recycled, 6-7 times, I think is the agreed opinion. After which it is, it disappears. So you need to chop down new trees. So depending on again, your definition, is it renewable sources? Is it lowest CO2 impact? Is it recyclability? It's difficult to give one answer here, as you've noticed, I think.
But this is all about consumer perception. And of course, tying into what you said before, this plastic waste or paper waste didn't get there on its own. It was dropped there by somebody, and that's most likely a consumer.
Yeah. Well, depending on the country you're looking at, Ton, I think your point is very valid. I mean, part of looking at which packaging material is the most sustainable for food was your question. Mm-hmm. For sure, there's an element where the consumer plays a role, but equally important, as I think I've stated, is the definition of sustainability. But regarding your point on littering, for example, for sure, consumer has a large role here. At the same time, it does not dismiss the manufacturer of a packaging for looking at more sustainable solutions.
Yeah, correct. That is so. Marcel, we've known each other for some years now, and I always remember how we talked about tea bags into the organic waste stream or not. Can you shed some light on this for our listeners?
I do remember these discussions, Ton. And this is something, I will not delve into the specifics of where that was and the company I was working for. But when I discovered that even organic tea contains plastic fibers in its filter material, which is normally cellulose, I was, shocked is not the word, but I was quite surprised and it seemed to me a little bit unbelievable that even for organic brands, it can be that there is plastics in certain parts where you would not expect it, or at least where you would think, and where consumers even more so would think it would be plastic free. So, and this is not putting the blame on anything or anyone. This is basically just, I guess, highlighting that the versatility of plastics and the added value they have for us as a society goes beyond, the soles of our shoes or the tires on our cars. But when it comes to packaging and products, plastic is pretty much everywhere. And there are applications, and I would say quite a few applications of plastics, which have alternatives. The example of the tea bags that you mentioned, this was added at some point because, consumers might have been complaining that the filter material was tearing, letting the tea leaves come out. So one solution is, and there are tea bags made entirely of plastics. Most tea bags are still filter paper, but by adding a few percent of polypropylene fibers, they found out that, hey, this tea bag now does not tear. And there not being particular bans in place of you doing this, that's where the industry moved to. So from an industrialization or mass production angle, it is very logical that plastics made entry in a rapid pace into our life, into our society. It's again, very versatile, very cheap, very strong, but it creates all kinds of challenges. So for the tea bags, which I think most consumers would, without a doubt, think this can go into the green waste. Yeah, so the kitchen and garden scraps.
Yep.
My thinking as a consumer was, okay, so each time I put a tea bag in my garden on my own compost heap, I'm basically adding microplastics into my garden. So I was, again, from that point of view, a bit shocked. And I think most consumers would agree that they would expect, particularly organic brands, but overall, that brands do the right thing. And at the same time, I guess some of us, not some of us, and we are on one hand maybe a little bit naive, or we like to trust brands, and on the other hand, sometimes we are very skeptical. So in terms of claims on packaging versus expectation of consumers, there's a bit of a gap there as well, perhaps.
Yeah.
The good thing is, though, at least in the Netherlands, that through working together with the Association for Tea and Coffee, and this is not only our institute, but we were part of the discussion, we had a similar approach as the deposit on small plastic bottles and metal cans, namely, dear industry, if you do not solve this issue by such and such date, we will impose measures from a government point of view. In the case of metal cans and plastic bottles, it was around littering and reduction of that, which, the industry did not manage to do, which in all honesty is also, I guess, a little bit difficult to ask brand owners to realize, but because that's where consumer behavior is more important. We saw a deposit being placed in the Netherlands on metal cans, which Germany has for ages, of course, and small bottles, which immediately pays off in terms of littering. And the same goes for tea bags, where basically the composers basically said, okay, if 80% at least of all these tea bags are plastic fiber free, we can agree to allow the tea bags on the official list of what products can go into the composting bin. And this is, of course, a little bit of a semantic discussion because on one hand, most consumers would already put their tea bags in there. On the other hand, by giving this signal, it basically forced the industry to start moving and get rid of these fibers. And I think this, on one hand, low-hanging fruit, on one hand, let's say, re-appreciating the materials that we had before or solutions that do not necessarily need plastic. I think this is something where we currently are. I talked about the switch from plastics to other materials because of the anti-plastic sentiments, if you will. Mm-hmm. This not necessarily is always a good thing because it could create solutions that have a higher environmental impact. For example, if you move from a nice monomaterial plastic bag to a combination of plastic and paper, for example, a question that we get quite often.
Yeah.
And I will not go into a tangent on this particular example, so closing your question on the tea bags for now.
Yeah. Another aspect, of course, we should always consider, and it's my pet topic, is fit for purpose packaging. The requirements for the packaging must match the shelf life and the time that is needed until it's consumed. What is your view on that?
Yeah, on one hand, I would fully agree. Packaging needs to be fit for purpose. This is a bit referring to the element that I mentioned. No underpacking, but please also no overpacking. So fit for purpose, particularly for food packaging, this is where the element of food waste certainly comes into play. And this element, I've been using this argument myself, that we need to add a bit more packaging material, making it even better fit for purpose, because we can prolong the shelf life from, say, 9 months to a year. And in theory, but also in practice, I guess, this would reduce food waste, because if you can keep it in the right condition for longer, then in theory, nothing or less would be wasted. This is a little bit my gut feel, but I think after a certain period of time, it doesn't necessarily create a benefit anymore. If you can keep your pasta for 1 year or a year and a half, I mean, for pasta, to be honest, I'm not even sure it has a best before date as long as you keep it dry. But certain products, I don't necessarily believe there is less food waste if you prolong it from 1 year to 2 years. If I look at myself as a very narrow example, but some products in my shelves or in my cupboard, I know that, this is in can, this can stay well for another couple of months, so I'll make a tuna sandwich next week or next month. And then you forget about it for a couple of weeks, and then half a year later you check it, it's across the best before date. Then I trust my nose, to be honest, so I will rarely throw away food unless I really see that it's, molded or whatever. So I really smell it, and then if it looks okay, I'm not afraid to still use it. A long answer to say that fit for purpose, I would certainly agree. At the same time, it's a broad definition, and it sometimes is misused, I guess, to argue that we need more packaging material or thicker film or whatever.
There was a time when even sugar and salt had best before dates, which was quite
Exactly.
ridiculous because salt has been sitting in the ground for millions of years, and now all of a sudden we needed to consume it within 2 years.
Yeah, no, that's a very good example. The same as vinegar and these type of products. And from a legislation point of view and liability point of view for the manufacturer, I understand it. You need to put a certain amount of information on it anyway, a production date, a batch, etc. And the standard is for food products to put a best before date on it. And this is again different per country. The UK has 3 different dates, I think, even sell before, sell by, best before, consume before, etc. So again, a bit of a definition thing. But if you're talking about low-hanging fruit in terms of sustainability of food packaging, and again, the combination with the product, putting a best before date on a product that has no expiry date, it sounds like a very simple thing to do. But this is something where, legislators need to come together with the industry and kind of think how to solve that. I mean, is it a simple thing of lifting that ban, or basically saying, don't put a best before date on these and these and these products, which has happened in some number of countries. Sometimes there is still the element of liability. If I have a product, I do not put a best before date on it, and 20 years later somebody opens the pack of salt, and I don't know, there could have been some moisture coming in and it doesn't look okay. I don't think anybody 20 years after buying it, they still have the receipt, to be honest. So I'm not sure how real this fear perhaps is, but it is a topic. Yeah.
In another interview, we have talked about greenwashing. Maybe you can say something about that. What problems with greenwashing have you encountered when it comes to packaging? Maybe you can say something about the KIDV of your association, which role you see in your association, how you can prevent greenwashing.
Yeah, greenwashing. Yes, certainly. This is I have personally a double take on this. But, starting from our association, we obviously get a lot of questions around what can I claim on my packaging regarding recyclability, natural, biodegradable, and so forth. And it's, again, logical that marketeers, they would like to emphasize a positive benefit of their packaging, particularly if you pay more for this material. Think about biodegradable or bio-based or recycled content, etc. So it's a logical thing, but there are not always clear definitions of what you can and cannot put on a packaging, or what you can and cannot claim, or if there's a logo for something, yes or no. This is, again, linking to some clearer European collaboration and rules would help, but also there's a lot of gray area in what you can claim. At the same time, there's more instruments that legislators or certain NGOs that are quite sensitive for these type of things, greenwashing, that they have to go to court, basically saying that, hey, you claim here that your product is all natural. How do you mean this? Because we see that, such and such artificial product is added, or so. It is a little bit of a minefield, is not the right word. There is room to wiggle on one hand to claim things that might not necessarily be true, but also not untrue. At the same time, there are some very clear cases where quite often NGOs, to be honest, environmental activistic organizations basically challenged brand owners and saying, hey, you claim here such and such. There would be the example of somebody saying, oh, this is raspberry juice. And in fact, we all know these examples. If you look at the ingredients, there's 0.1% of raspberry in it. So on one hand, we're getting a bit smarter and say more honest about what we claim and what we do. But on a lot of areas, there is not necessarily a definition or an example case that you can look at. Particularly for this reason, we set up collaborating with a law firm specialized in these type of cases on claims on packaging. We call that a fact sheet. So there's basically, we add together a number of examples, a number of cases, definitions on what you can and cannot claim on a packaging. That would already help with this point of greenwashing. But again, as I said, personally, I do think there's 2 sides to things. Beyond the point of obvious greenwashing, meaning let's call it lying for now. It's not the right word, perhaps, but sometimes people did not necessarily research properly or could not find the data to support their claim. Then maybe the right thing to do is if you're not 100% certain you can back up a claim, perhaps don't put it on there. But I would also think there's a number of examples where companies think they do the right thing, and they even pay extra for a certain packaging material, etc. And thinking they can have a certain advantage by telling consumers that they are, I don't know, biodegradable, better recyclable, lower CO2 impact. You name the claims. That in reality turns out might not necessarily be true. And this is not necessarily out of evil intent or negativity, but lack of knowledge perhaps, or unclarity in rules and definitions and so forth. So I personally also feel that sometimes a little bit of room for, I wouldn't call it room for greenwashing, but this is something that we need to learn and understand better. What can we and can we not claim? And if these movements to a more greener or ecological packaging, it comes and goes with ups and downs, let's put it like this. But if it's an overall movement in the right direction, meaning more sustainable packaging, however vague the definition perhaps, I would say, there's a little bit of room to wiggle and leave some benefit of the doubt. Maybe that's the way of looking at it, I guess. I mean, sometimes putting new materials on the market makes it difficult to recycle them, because the current infrastructure, for example, is not used to this type of new materials. The current waste infrastructure for packaging waste is very much centered around the type of packaging materials we currently put on the market. So, the regular plastics, paper and carton, etc. There might be new solutions around that, if they would be implemented on a large scale, have a far better environmental footprint. But because currently they are not being recycled, you would have to say that, this is not being recycled. Yes, it's in theory a better packaging, more sustainable, the lowest carbon footprint, etc. So it's, and I don't exactly know how to say this in English. In Dutch we say het kind met het badwater weggooien. You know what I mean, Ton? So it's basically, you could say sometimes these things stifle innovation. So it's understandable. We do not want greenwashing, particularly if it's done on purpose, to say so to say, when it comes closer to lying or.
Yeah, but to tap into that just briefly, and I think one of the things that is also happening is not the conscious greenwashing, but it's also the subconscious greenwashing. So if, for example, you change a plastic pack to a paper pack, or give it the haptic, the feel and touch and look of paper, whilst on the inside there is lots of plastic as laminates, then this is greenwashing, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like your example, Ton, and this is one that I've been thinking about a lot. The move from plastics to non-plastic alternatives. That seems to be happening a lot these last years. Personally, I would rather see a fully plastic packaging with some ink on it that makes it look like paper, even though, I would agree it's some sort of a greenwashing or deceiving the consumer. But in terms of recyclability, at least that packaging has a far greater chance of being recycled with plastics than if you actually glue paper to plastic, because then it cannot be recycled with the paper packaging, cannot be recycled in plastic, so can only be incinerated in the end or landfilled.
Exactly. This is what I meant with the subconscious.
Exactly.
That's tricky.
It is. Yeah, it is.
So I think this brings us to the end of this episode. Very interesting point you mentioned, and gives us stuff to think about. Is there anything you would like to add still, which you want to share with our listeners?
As you know, Ton, I like talking about packaging and sustainability thereof, and all the elements linked to it. So I could talk for a long time. I mean,
there must be maybe there's one point which you say, well, come to think of it, this is something I'd like to mention to the people.
If there's one thing I would like to tell the listeners by ending this podcast, Ton, a good question. Well, I guess the one element that I see a lot of potential in for sustainability of packaging would be reusable packaging in this case, obviously. Some countries already have reasonable experience with this. For some countries, it's quite new. In terms of prevention of waste, and not only packaging, but waste in general as a society, I think we've forgotten a lot about the benefits of reuse, whether it's fashion, cars, furniture, toys, etc. I think we need to reappreciate what we already have and not, throw it away and buy a new one. We have been living in a discard society for a long time. This is on one hand linking to the convenience that I mentioned. For packaging, it's quite obvious if you have a small film around your candy bar. But there's a number of elements in packaging of food, but also non-food, where a reusable packaging is a very realistic alternative. Yeah. If you can reuse a packaging, let's say 30 or 50 times, it basically prevents you from 29 or 49 or more single-use items being thrown away. And even if these are recycled, it still takes energy to collect them, to melt down and then recreate them, to sort, to purify, etc. And yes, of course, reusable packaging, it has an impact in itself because you need to clean it. So it takes detergents and water, etc. But I feel there's quite a few cases where moving to reusable packaging could have a significant benefit. Ideally like to see consumers reappreciating these type of models, and then ideally not only for packaging but other elements of our life as well. So that would be my closing statement, if you will.
Well, thank you, Marcel, for that. So this concludes another episode of our podcast, PACKOLUTION. Thank you again, Marcel, for sharing your experiences and your vision with and without sustainable packaging. Very inspiring for us and hopefully for our listeners as well. Please stay tuned in this channel for more inspiring episodes of PACKOLUTIONs with stakeholders in the packaging industry. Thank you. Talk to you next time.